Thank you very much, everyone. We'll now move to our second panel discussion. Our second discussion is looking at, once we have citizens engaged, how can they be empowered to act, and focusing particularly around government policy and how government policy can be empowering, whether it's expenditure policy, taxation measures or regulation, and how they can underpin climate action by citizens and communities. The discussion will be moderated by Professor Alan Barrett. He's Director of the ESRI, and I'm sure known to all of you. So I'll now hand over to Alan, who will introduce the panellists and proceed with the second discussion.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So let me kick off with just a couple of quick remarks. So Brian has given the description of what this session is about, and indeed I think when Mark Griffin's contribution earlier on, he sort of painted this picture that you have sort of policy at one particular level, a sort of central government level in particular, then we've got a sort of lot of activity at local and community level, and there's a bit of a sense that it would be a good idea to try and join these sort of things up as best we possibly can. So that's kind of almost like a theoretical way of looking at this, but I thought I'd motivate it a bit more precisely with an example. Okay, and I think this example, I would argue, is possibly the greatest policy failure in the history of the state. All right, and you'll see the parallel in a second. So the example I'm going to take is the Irish language. All right, and the connection between the Irish language on the one hand and climate action on the other is the following. Okay, in order for language policy to be successful, you are 100% reliant on individuals and communities actually speaking the language. All right, and when you think about climate action, okay, there's lots of things governments can do here, but fundamentally, if people and communities don't behave in particular ways, okay, and don't sort of take ownership, the policy is in a sense doomed. All right, so again, if you take the Irish language, this is an area where the Irish government has spent millions over the years. It has had huge amounts of regulations, okay, such things as Irish language in schools, public bodies having to produce things in Irish, rafts and rafts of legislation around the Irish language. And yet, as a policy, if you think that the goal was to generate a very, very active, widespread use of the Irish language, it has completely failed. That must be somebody from an Irish language agency who's now objecting to my characterisation of policy in that area. Okay, so in many ways, imagine 100 years ago if the Irish, so we had an event like this and the discussion was held about, right, we're going to have policies at the central level that are going to try and impact on the speaking of the Irish language. What are the sort of connections that we need to have between central government and communities and individuals to ensure that policy works? Okay, imagine if we had done that 100 years ago. Obviously we didn't. So the question here for us then today is, we're going to have all this sort of policy initiatives, policy discussions, and in fairness to government, I think a real policy, a willingness to engage and to do the right things. But the question is, how can we ensure that whatever policies happen at that high level are sort of are connecting at a community and individual level with a view to making sort of good things happen? So that's essentially how I envisage this particular panel. You know, we'll talk about the sort of the big areas of policy such as taxation, expenditure, regulation, possibly education as well. But we'll think in terms of the policy tools, but how can they best be deployed in such a way to get optimal outcomes at the local level? So that's, I hope I haven't scared the panel in terms of characterising what I hope we're going to do today. So we'll follow the process of the previous panel, whereas I'm going to give each of the guys a couple of minutes to kick things off, and then we'll try and get it into the audience as quickly as possible. So with that, can I hand over to Lorna Gold from Trócaire? Laura.
Thanks very much. Delighted to be here this afternoon. As well as all the other things that have been hosted in this room was actually the place where Stop Climate Chaos Coalition was inaugurated 12 years ago. So I think we have to celebrate that as well this morning. One climate story that grabbed my attention this week was a new report that came out about Antarctica. I'm sure those of you, all of us here today, read this on Twitter about the 241 billion tonnes per year that are of ice that are melting, tripling since 2012, and how we are totally unprepared for the resulting sea level rises in the timeframes that scientists are now predicting. It's a shocking story, one of those stories of despair, you could say. But what's even more shocking is that it didn't even make the mainstream news. And nobody this morning has even mentioned the role of media. With the exception of The Guardian, this has been a non-story this week. And yet it kept me, and I'm sure some other people who are addicted to Twitter, awake most of the night 2 nights ago. For me, this profound disconnect between climate change and society right now is really at the heart of what we're talking about today, and I think the last panel really nailed that question. You wouldn't know how serious the situation is, the urgency of the situation, if you were talking to most people on the street today. That's the backdrop we need to be facing when we're talking about communities and meaningful action on climate change. I think 3 things are needed, and some of them have already been mentioned in the last panel, but they're very relevant to the policy environment. The first is education. The facts. The facts. Do people really understand the facts of climate change? The sad reality is that our children in primary school know more about climate change than most adults. They understand it. So we can't just honestly focus on the young people. We need to focus on lifelong education, on ways to reach a large number of the population with a deeper understanding of the facts. And what's the proof that this works? The Citizens' Assembly. When people were given the time to understand the facts, to come to terms with what those facts mean for them, their families, their communities, they came up with the most radical, the most ambitious manifesto for climate action that the country has seen. So the facts are really important, and how we really reach people beyond the mainstream education sector. The second one, which has been mentioned, is leadership. I would say we need leadership, leadership, leadership. This morning's panel and the fine words of the Taoiseach and the commitments of funding, if it's new funding, are really encouraging. But having been in the game for 10 years now for climate change and seeing us second last in Europe in terms of the Cannes report, we need more than words. We need to see it translated. We need strategic alignment. We need policy coherence. And I'm afraid government has to do the heavy lifting. Central government has to do the heavy lifting on that. There's no point educating communities on the seriousness of the challenge if we don't also give them the means to implement those decisions. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this panel. We need to talk about it in terms of the near term, in terms of people's children, in terms of coastal communities and how they're going to be impacted by sea level rise. We need to empower people to understand the facts and then empower them with the mechanisms to engage in meaningful solutions. Also when those solutions are very troubling, as is the case with a lot of coastal communities and the situation that Florida is now facing in terms of 20, 30, 40-year timeline. The word retreat is what has been used in the USA now. The third thing, and finally, is communities. This morning, so far, I haven't heard any real questioning of what do we mean by communities. Is it about local, rural communities that need to be empowered? I would really say yes, but we need to move beyond traditional communities, our understanding of traditional local communities. Communities are everywhere. They're offline, online. We sometimes call them networks now. Places of worship, university campuses, sports clubs, societies. It's at that level, I feel, that we need to be connecting the dots so that it's national and also local. I was going to say infiltrating, but that's not the right word. Influencing the agendas of those communities and connecting with what their stories are telling them about the future and how it links to their children's future. I think
30 seconds.
Yep, faith communities, of different types are really important in this regard. We have parishes throughout the country, engaging them in Pope Francis's message on integral ecology is really key. Universities with their Green Campus network and their outreach to the communities are another type of community that we can engage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Go to Ryan Howard.
Thank you, Lorna. I have nothing much to say now. I'm going to introduce myself in 4 parts. The first part is Elaine. I have a dream. I had a dream about 3 years ago after reading an article from Rutgers University in the States, where they found that there was a direct connection between the restoration of habitat for the native bee and mitigating against climate change. People could make a difference. Yeah. I also, around the same time, read a wonderful article on Gardener's World, the magazine, BBC magazine, about a guy in Ipswich, and he was sitting at his, watching his TV and getting sick of the story of continuously hearing the story of the death of the bee, the removal, the number of butterflies that were disappearing. And he went out in his garden, dug up a bit of grass and put in some wildflower seed, convinced his neighbour to do the same, and within 3 years they had the largest man-made pollinator corridor in the UK. My dream, if you've got a phone or a way of recording, write down wild work or follow up. When you get the opportunity, look up wild work, rather than me going into the definition of everything of what I mean in terms of the dream we have in our organisation. Ultimately, what we're saying is, with the community connectivity that we have in this country, we have a huge amount of linkage at a community level. Our ambition is to grow Europe's largest man-made pollinator corridor, to bring farmers together, schools together, communities together, and businesses. And we started with this concept 3 years ago, and pretty fast I ran into a wall. There was nobody going to fund it. Everybody liked it, but money, sure, you could do it free. Maybe the volunteers will take that on as well. So we kept at it, and my organisation is a small charity. I'll speak to it in a minute. One of our directors, Louis Duffy's here. But our organisation took the first step and said, we're going to take most of our reserve and we're going to invest it in this from our rainy day fund into this concept. Because we saw the rainy day as now. What's happening in climate change has to be addressed now. We cannot keep standing back. So the first investor in our programme was our own company. We then worked in conjunction with the School of Bees in UCC, and they've been wonderful with us. Cork County Council have started at the coalface. The guys at the coalface actually understand what's happening, the interaction between environment and community, and what that can actually mean, bringing people out of their houses to talk to each other, new communities getting to learn and work with existing communities, young and old. Everybody has an interest in the environment. And if you can if you can move, you bring in the expert, the ecologist, the person who's able to guide them through the process, you will keep moving. Yesterday, my board agreed to us hiring in 3 new ecologists. Our team now will be 5 full-time ecologists. Within a community development organisation, you don't find ecologists. And it was really interesting when I went to advertise for this, because we met lots of ecologists who are highly skilled but can't get work. Nobody wants to hire them as ecologists. It's amazing, isn't it? And yet we want to do something about climate change. A lot of talk, a lot of structure, but not a lot of investment, actually very little. But what saved us in the last year is the private sector. We turned our model over and started targeting and working with our partners in the private sector. So the big investors we have right now are Pfizer in Cork Harbour, Cork Airport, GSK, Glenillan, the organic milk producer. These guys are investing. They want to see this happen. They don't want me to talk about it. They just want to see this happening. We're working with our staff in terms of the interaction they're having and bringing home the message to their home and to their villages as well. So there is spark, there is opportunity, there is hope, and it's being led by the local development sector on one side, ourselves, and by the private sector. There is movement at the local government sector level, but we need to see an awful lot more. I've taken a lot of time to explain my dream.
That's okay. So I noticed the panel is already exceeding the 2 minutes, so
okay.
We'll have less time with them when we do the questions. I just want to make sure we do get into questions. But Jeanne from NESC.
Well, I'll follow a dream. That's a wonderful, hopeful story to follow on. I work at the National Economic and Social Council, and the Council provides strategic economic, social and sustainable development advice to government. And we have been working in around climate change space for a number of years. We've done reports on climate, we've done work on social and behavioural aspects of climate change, one of my own particular areas. We've done work around the circular economy, and more recently we're doing a series of sort of projects looking at climate governance. And I think that's something that's coming up a lot this morning, and something I just wanted to touch on. Because when we think of communities of place, such as small towns, and communities of interest, we're hearing about one now in schools and green teams in offices who are working to reduce emissions, and they're doing it in creative ways. They're doing energy efficiency, cycling to work, introducing reusable cups. Bring that up to scale, though, or heighten the ambition, and the barriers and challenges become clearer. And we know some of those barriers, partial or non-existent cycling infrastructure, inability to access a grid if you're producing renewable energy in a community, microgeneration, sort of plastics onto our food, community ownership. There are some of the structural barriers we face. But there are other issues that stand out. One is, in order to support these new habits and practices, they need tailored supports and opportunities so they aren't operating in isolation. And that needs a framework of national and local level that, I suppose, supports and connects these local actions so they become part of something bigger. They become networks that grow, and eventually they become communities of practice, what I like to call communities of practice, or they're networks of practice. And the challenge is to convey and animate national policies administered by departments and agencies through increased engagement and deliberation, and we're hearing a lot about that today. But the key thing is the learning can be peer-to-peer, from community to community, up and down with expertise, up to national and local level, and bringing these insights up to, in a way, invigorate and renew policies. And I'm very captivated by the Sustainable Energy Communities model, because I think that really captures what I'm saying, is that they have people on the ground in communities being resourced, they have these new mentors who are giving expertise, and they are then being developed and grown into a very active network. And I think we need to remind ourselves that a transition is more than incremental change. It involves system-wide, structural and societal change. And that's going to bring uncertainty, bumpiness in the road, and often governments are making decisions somewhat blind. So we need, in a way, to think about new approaches to governance, because it's not just a technical and economic challenge, it's a social and cultural one too. And the state can play a strategic role, and it's why we need to bring those opportunities that are already happening at communities. We need to strengthen those, and really need to bring in those key skills of deliberation and reflexivity, I knew something was going to get me, into government, to be able to think about how do we build that learning and draw that capacity in. I'm happy to go on about our wind energy work, but I'll let my colleague Lúgh come in.
Good, yes.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Jeanne. Energy Cooperatives Ireland have been involved since 2011 in setting up, in dealing with over 250 communities collectively, and including being closely involved in the establishment of 3 working, strong renewable energies cooperatives in the west of Ireland, from Mayo down to Kerry. So, in our role working with the for the SAI, in fact, on the SEC programme, we have been doing an awful lot of work with communities we have in our western region, which is there is well over 30 community groups that are participating in the SEC programme. What we've all found is that there is no end of energy, volunteerism and commitment and a willingness to learn in the community sector, particularly as it deals with conservation and sustainability. We've made enormous progress, and with the help of Ruth and Caroline in the SAI, and the hard work that all of the community groups are doing throughout the country, we have established collectively a very, very strong peer-to-peer information network, whereby communities like our established cooperatives who are further along the road have been able to themselves become mentors. There is no shortage of experienced community activists in the renewable sector and the energy conservation sector, of people willing to come forward and share their information. That information is very rapidly received and is worked upon by a new community group that gets involved. The learning, no problem. The engagement is also no problem. There's been a massive amount of work done on the level of energy conservation and imaginative thinking about sustainability. Most communities are very innovative in spotting opportunities in their own region or in their own locale. We've also been engaged, of course, in the kind of communities that Lorna has been talking about as well, which are the large-scale ones, for example, NUIG and GMIT, where are communities that we deal in. Also, that expertise is available to the network and feeds down through it. Fantastic. You can see from what Liam was talking about earlier how Castlebraney has progressed through their own hard work, through volunteerism, but also through being helped out. What I think we've got the sense of, in terms of even the long-term planning that was discussed earlier on, but also the mood that I was picking up from some of the contributions from everybody here, I think that what we were getting is, now what? Where do we go now? We have engaged communities, we have informed communities, we have innovative communities, communities of scale and communities of diversity. We have them. Where do we go next? We have done a lot of work on the energy conservation area. There's the BEC programme has helped an awful lot of people get on the first step. Helps them more than just insulating their buildings. It helps them to think imaginatively. Helps them to pull together in a kind of like a coordinated, business-ready structure. So what happens next? There's a thirst for engagement in generation projects. So what's the barrier to them? The barrier to them is, by and large, let's leave the soon-to-be announced RESS. I imagine that's coming out. Let's leave that to one side. But to get communities into the position where they will be able to participate in whatever the structures that the RESS are going to provide, we need to provide communities with kind of a different kind of mentoring. Mentoring that's backed up by money. And that mentoring is going to be, I would imagine, I would hope, is going to be identifying clearly the achievable renewable generation projects that are going to be fit for purpose with the local authorities, going to satisfy planning regulations. Identify them, and they're going to benefit the communities. Identify them. They have to go into design, they have to go into legal issues, and they have to go through planning. That costs money. What we need is a fund which is set aside specifically to move, which is like the mentor model for the sustainability piece, which helps communities to move on. Conscious of the fact that I've probably used up 2 minutes, but very quickly, our hope is, our request is that part of the 500 million that was announced today for this climate change action that's going to come along, some of that surely has to be set aside to take the burden off the volunteer groups who are committing of their time, take the risks from them, and provide them with the kind of backing, early money that you need, that developers have for themselves, the state companies have for themselves, the communities can't get. Give it to them. I guarantee you, we progress this through much quicker than we'd envisaged if that money wasn't there. So I think that's the thing. How do we get communities beyond the level of engagement into the practical edge? We want to get direct participation in generation. I think most communities that I speak to say that. And I think that there are policy decisions that would be easy. It's just a question of allowing people to do what they are well able to do. Give them the support they need.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, so we'll go to the audience in a sec, but I do want to follow up with 2 questions, and I'm going to ask for really, really snappy answers. So, Ryan, if I can come to you first, you made reference there to engagement with the private sector, and very positive engagement. What lessons can you give government officials from your experience of engaging with private sector folks?
I suppose, first of all, I think in terms of this whole conversation, sometimes they're left out of it. It's interesting when you actually meet with the larger bodies, the organisations, even as SMEs, how little sometimes they're brought into the conversation. And I think this is a key. There's 4 parts to a good conversation. There's the academic, the research in the background. There's the public, the guys who are here from representing the state and representing local government. There's the private, and then there's the civil engagement. And unfortunately, sometimes two or more of those are not present when these debates and discussions and strategies are shaped. At the moment, we're talking, like I see a gap in what's been talked about already today, but I'm not going to go into it. But to me, the civil engagement piece is still not clear. There's an opportunity though in Ireland. We have a unique set of structures all across this island that can act and play a role in that space, but so far not engaged. I won't reveal all yet.
Okay, sounds good. And I'm going to ask a really blunt question to you, Lúgh. Okay, so you talked about, again, the state funding local communities or whatever like that, all right, and I spent a couple of years of my career in the Department of Finance, okay, and they sort of infected my brain in a way I'm now going to display. People like the Department of Finance are basically sort of terrified about handing over money to people because they'll always have the suspicion that it's not going to be used well in some shape or form, okay? And I suppose the question is, when you deal or you think of dealing with officials in the Department of Finance, what sort of processes do you sort of propose and envisage, to sort of fight against that mentality from central government, especially from the Department of Finance, Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, that, oh God, we're going to hand over this money and we're going to lose control and those guys are going to waste it. I'm not suggesting that is what people do, but there is a mindset in central government along those lines.
That's absolutely reasonable. I mean, it's completely pie in the sky thinking to imagine that the Department of Finance is going to bankroll communities 100% for their energy projects. That's just crazy. But there are mutual microfinancing models that are well established, whereby monies can be made available to communities on the basis that it's paid back once the project is up and running. Okay, and then therefore the onus is on the communities to ensure and guarantee that they go through their process. But that the risk is taken from them. But they go to their program. Once you have a shovel-ready project, you'll get your finance all right. But when that will be based on commercial lending. So that commercial lending will then, therefore, will only approve those projects that are going to be successful. At that point, that money comes back, so that it recycles into the environment and into the community sector. So I would imagine this. If Castlebar is going to engage in a project, it gets its help. When it gets this over, there's another community down the road that's looking for that money back. Thank you very much. Okay, no wastage. That has worked in other in other sectors. Often the cruelest eye is the eye of your neighbour. Okay. And that can often really keep your. I'm
wondering, Jeanne, do you want to comment on that?
Can I come in? Because Nest did some work on building community engagement and social support for wind energy, and one of the things that came out very strongly was the critical role of intermediary bodies. And intermediary bodies like the ones we're hearing about for recycling ambassadors, climate ambassadors, but also Lúgh's work in SAI, these mentors. Now that involves a kind of expertise. He's talking about the technical expertise. But it also involves bodies like CARES in Scotland, which provide seed money to community projects. So it is an investment. Often that seed money does not come back. But that's investing in communities to develop their own energy projects. And then along with that comes the financial legal expertise. And that model works really well. And it gets communities really interested and willing, and it takes away that fear factor, because that was often the case when we were doing the wind energy work. Developers are often saying, "Oh, communities don't want to be getting engaged in all of this. We'll leave it to developers all the time." And there was a lot of communities saying, "Well, actually, if you give us the guidance and support, we might be able to do that." And we can see from Tipperary Energy Agency and the energy cooperatives that actually they can, if you provide that kind of skilled, and I mean, obviously it's ring-fence money, but it's a state agency or endorsed set of registered intermediary actors who can go into communities and bridge that gap between state and local.
Okay, so let me go to the audience at this stage. And again, if you can try and sort of keep questions to this theme of sort of linking central government policy and local and community activities. So I'm going to cast my eye around, and I see a couple of hands going up already. So we'll start sort of on the aisle. And again, if you can do the usual of name and affiliation, please.
Yeah, my name's Sandy Dunlop. I'm coordinator of the Terranure Better Energy, and I'm also on the Green Foundation board. And one of our primary focuses was connecting not with the activists, but with the ordinary people, and trying to make sense as to why they might be interested in this. And one of the key things is that it makes some kind of commercial sense at a household level, and then also at a community level. And we've been working very hard at that over the last few years. And I think as a result of some of the things like the home audits that have been done and some of the work, we're beginning to be able to paint a picture, because what the householders want to know is, what do I have to do, and what is it going to cost, and what are the benefits? And one of the things that would make a big difference is if we could get to a pay-as-you-save scheme, and we're trying to work that out. So, because even in a Terranure, to find 30 to 35 grand to do a deep retrofit, that is a lot of money. They just don't have that money. So a small percentage do, but the bulk don't. The thing that I'm mainly interested in, though, is if you start to aggregate it at a community level. And just to give you some numbers, in South Dublin, there are 100,000 houses. To retrofit them at 35 grand a house is £3.5 billion worth of work. There is an energy bill of 500 million at current consumption. To shift that to renewables is a huge shift. And the crowd that are going to do it most is the communities. The problem is that communities are based on voluntarism, which raises one issue, which is how volunteers shift. Because to work on these at 15 to 20 hours a week, this a colleague of mine here from Dunleer was saying, don't take it on, you'll end up in an early grave, because it is extremely stressful running these projects. 15 to 20 hours a week, your wife's going to give you grief, your business is going to suffer, your health will probably suffer.
Okay, maybe can we leave it there? I'm eager to get more people in, please.
There's one very quick thing, which is to do with how to finance it, because it's going to have to be financed locally. And I would have liked to say to the Minister, thank you for announcing on page 21 on this, the feed-in tariff. It's here, page 21. That's very good news, if that's what's intended. And secondly, to ask him, would he consider using pensions? So the person I wanted to ask is the Minister. I don't see him here. But pensions could be a way of diverting some pension money to finance some of these changes, particularly investment in community.
Okay, thank you. I think there was a... can we just go to the front here? There's a... Actually, well... Sorry now. We'll get the... Thanks, Orca.
Hi, Phil Walker from eConservative. I run the EcoMerit Environmental Certification Programme. On the funding issue, I have a suggestion. The last time I looked, we more or less own the banks. Money is worth about 0% just now. I've been told we can't do this, but no one's ever told me why. Why don't we just tell the banks to give low-interest loans at maybe 1 or 2% to support these projects?
A simple, succinct question, which I'll be thrown to the panel in a minute or two now. We'll just go to the gentleman there, and then we'll go back to the person who nearly asked.
I'm Dermot O'Connell. I'm past chairman of the Cork Environmental Forum and currently on the BPN Secretariat in Cork. We have a community that's already living differently, travelling differently, doing things differently. They have a huge commitment to the environment, but primarily it's a lifestyle choice, and it's the lifestyle choice that's going to attract the best and the brightest to come and work here. It's difficult to get them in a room, but it's very easy to talk to them. We have a lot of consultation. We had the community visioning plan recently, and people are very forthright in the way they want to work. You know, in Italy we drive everywhere. Nobody in Cork has a car. That's the vision, that's the feeling of the people who've come. And it doesn't matter if they've come from Mayo or Donegal or Spain or Italy. They arrive into the city. The lifestyle is the lifestyle that you're talking that we'll all have to move to. I'm coming here from the future. It's not difficult. This is the lifestyle people want. But we find that the way the country as a whole is laid out, that people are being pushed away constantly from this lifestyle. Things like rates in the city centre, forcing their employers to move from city centre locations to business parks. They have no idea where they are or how they'll get there, so they leave the job and get a job in Berlin. To motorways being built instead of houses, to simple things like wheelie bins in city centres, which are designed for rural areas, and housing estates, which literally don't fit in our streets. We have a lot of very constructive engagement with the City Council. And the City Council, by and large, understands these issues. They don't do everything we want in the PPN, nor should they. But local authorities and local bodies in general in Ireland have little to no autonomy. If the City Council wants to put in a pedestrian crossing, it has to go to the Department of Environment in Dublin. While it's reasonable to expect a community to develop a working relationship with a local authority, it's not reasonable to imagine that a community like ours, which is very different to the communities that most of you come from, in rural or suburban Ireland, with very different concerns, can build that relationship with the Department of Environment. So do we not think that we need to be more responsive up and down through the local authorities, and by giving more autonomy to local bodies, if we are going to empower communities and allow the bespoke changes that suit the different and diverse communities that make up the country?
Okay, thanks for that. There was another question. We were about to get and I'll tell you, has the microphone? Oh, you have the microphone. Brilliant.
Jose Ospina from NC Insulation. We're a better energy home scheme based in Cork. I'm also the Secretary of Carberry Housing Association, an approved housing body, and I'm on the Strategic Policy Committee for Housing for Cork County. Now, there's a number of very interesting issues that have come up, and it's hard to encapsulate a response to them, but it seems to me two things. Until you have housing strategy on board, we don't really have joined up thinking, because the problem, a big issue, the major issue perhaps, is housing strategy. And it's not just new build housing, it's not just good new planning regulations, it's existing housing. They are the problem. And it was said a few weeks ago in the press that you need to retrofit 700,000 homes in Ireland in order to achieve the targets that the European Commission has agreed for Ireland. Now, that is going to require buy-in from the local authorities that own a lot of the low-income properties that are actually in this problem, that are not really fully addressing the retrofit, the energy efficiency problem. I sit on the committee, and energy is hardly ever mentioned. We talk about rents, we talk about maintenance, we don't talk about energy. It's hardly ever mentioned. It should be a major issue. It needs to be at the top of the agenda there. But it's not just the public sector, it's not just the local authorities, there's housing associations, approved housing bodies through the housing agency could also be made to take this on board. Some approved housing bodies have taken it on board, but more as a token issue, not as a fully fledged priority issue. Again, the housing agency could take this on board. Then you have the private sector. Now, they're the difficult ones to bring in, because half of those properties at least will be privately owned. How do you get them to engage? It's not going to be through creating goodwill and a feeling of community. It's going to be through something that benefits them. They need incentives in order to participate. I would suggest tax breaks for retrofit. Any money invested in retrofit be tax deductible. Now, that would be a start in order to persuade private owners to contribute to what is essentially a national target. The other issue I'd like to make is the general picture. What is missing is a good national strategy towards the social economy. What we're talking about is social economy enterprises. In order to engage communities, it's not just a matter of getting the communities to support our actions, to support our policies. It's a matter of getting communities to be players in the actions. And the only way they're going to do that is by being members of enterprises, being members of social enterprises, of co-ops, of groups that actually have a stake, a real stake as enterprises. That is, put them on an equal footing to the private sector, but recognize their social contribution, their environmental contribution, and give them special privileges in order to compete effectively, to create a level playing field, in order to really allow communities to participate.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll take another few questions, but I just want to come back to Lorna. A number of issues, sort of points being raised about this notion of needing to interconnect, okay, and when things, be it across government or regions, whatever like that, are disconnected, it doesn't work. Now, one of your sort of three items was the question of leadership, okay? But I always, when somebody sort of says this thing, oh, we need leadership, I'm always sort of left wondering, what does that actually mean? Okay, so do you want to link your earlier comments about this need for leadership to some of the points that have been made here about the need for sort of coordination?
Yeah, I mean, I think a theme that's coming out really strongly this morning or today is around the chicken or the egg. And it seems to almost be like a circular discussion. Are we talking about communities first, or are we talking about national government? Are we talking about individuals? Are we talking about households? So there are so many interconnections between the different issues we're talking about. Where does leadership fit into that? I think, to me, it's at a national level, we need to recognise that government still needs to do the heavy lifting here. It's about carbon tax. It's about addressing the structural imbalances within the economy in order to make the sustainable lifestyle something that's aspirational, something that is cost effective, something that people can readily take on. So leadership there is about having the bold vision, which supposedly Ireland 2040 is, to make those difficult decisions around carbon tax. A real carbon tax, a carbon tax that is going to shift the game in terms of the choices that individuals make in their households, in their communities. So that's one side of leadership, to me, at a national level that needs to be there. Then we're talking about, so it's walking the talk on that. And then I think the fear is that communities, if we were to implement the carbon tax today, would rebel against it. Because we don't aspire to low carbon lifestyles, largely. We aspire to high carbon lifestyles. We aspire to fly off on our holidays. We aspire to consume more. And we're driven to high consumption. So it's about squaring that circle then at a local level of those innovators. I would say if you talk about it in terms of innovation, the bell curve of innovation, we're at the cusp of innovation becoming mainstream because we have the technology to change things in terms of the energy sector. The macro shift is happening in terms of the financial world, in terms of the fossil fuel divestment and stranded assets in terms of fossil fuels. We know that is energy transition is happening. So it's about both ends. It's about leadership at a local level, sustaining that, supporting that. Volunteerism, I can really relate to the gentleman who talked from Terranure. Those who are volunteering tend to be volunteering on everything, and this is something that's additional. It needs to go beyond volunteering to cooperatives, to social enterprises, and sustaining that. There are leaders. It's about supporting them.
Okay, very good answer, I have to say. Okay, we have another few minutes for another few questions, so we get another few hands. Okay,
Can I just come in just quickly on the
30 seconds.
Yeah, just that one of the key areas of our work that we identified was this idea of sharing local value of community projects, and I think that's a key point. Is that communities in Denmark and Germany, they are motivated to share in the value of community energy. That over 50% of Germany renewables is owned by citizens. So it's a very important point that you need to have skin in the game. You need to be an entrepreneur to have the innovative ideas, but to see rewards for that. And I think that is a critical piece. And the other point I'd make is that some of these problems that we're hearing today, there are no ready answers, and what they require is a kind of problem-solving approach of deliberation. So you bring experts together with local innovators, and you really have to crunch and make some hard choices and deliberations with the people who are actively involved in it. And that's a new model, in a way, for our new climate era, is this kind of problem-solving deliberation. We need to do more of that.
Okay, so there were a few hands. Now, we're getting really tight in time, so we've got 1 minute contributions. Okay, and I literally a minute.
Here, we do a lot of engagement locally, and I really echo the sentiments from the two ladies. What we could do with is a boutique of paid consultants in this space, and also tax breaks to actually harvest the divestment from fossil fuels and invest in our future. So we have all these aspirational policy plans for 2040, but where are the steps? And where the engagement from the local authorities, because they're paid actors in this room, and there's a lot of us volunteers here, so it would be very respectful at least to have responses from our local authorities and paid staff to support the volunteerism, and also invest locally on the ground sooner. Because the current climate is, as Sandy has echoed, they fob you off, they exhaust you, and they leave you out. So this cannot be tolerated. We need some transparency and actually audited actions in this volunteer space. And minimum thank yous for the volunteers on the ground, because it's hard work.
Hi, Sarah Miller from the Rediscovery Centre. We've heard a lot about intermediaries and the power and the support they can give in empowering communities. I suppose I'm keen to hear, there's a lot of really good work already happening across the country, so how do you think this support can be really mobilised to support those organisations and those groups and the communities that are already doing great work in Ireland?
Thank you, Edmund Grace of People Talk. Just a question about, everyone here is deeply committed and fired up about the whole issue of climate action. But, and there are plenty of groups around the country, but there are still many people in the country who have yet really to be educated and fired up. And my question is, we're going to have this national dialogue on climate action. Do you have anything to say to that process about how do you spread the news? Because with all due respect, it's still a very small group of people who are doing things, I would suggest.
Thank you for that. There was a hand at the back, so we maybe just squeeze in another quick contribution.
Thank you. Karina Ward, Community Development Coordinator in Ishturk. I think rather than leadership, we need facilitation. I'm on the LCDC in Mayo, and a trend I imagine up and down the country is that we have most of our budget already allocated to community facilities and social inclusion, because historically Ireland leaned on the community sector in times of recession, like we need to do now around this issue. And you get the biggest bang for your buck when you give it to the community, they'll spend it. So I think we need development workers, like we had community development workers in communities, and now those people are already empowered. We don't have the same amount of community development workers, unfortunately, but people are still empowered from that period when we did have them. So I think that that's where we need to put the money.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to come back to the panel at this stage. We're tight on time, so this time I am going to be really strict. And I hate to do it, but 30 seconds, just an instinctive reaction to everything you've heard. We'll start.
Okay, cool. I hope we're not going from left to right ideologically. Anyway, I entirely agree. The county councils have been huge supporters. I know in Mayo, for example, Corinne would know this as well, the county councils have engaged in a large consultation exercise with every community down to the finest grained level. That consultation process has created subgroups that have moved into the SEC programme and gone on from the SEC programme. They have ambitions for generation. So when a local authority, for example Mayo, takes its brief seriously about community consultation, empowerment, and then upskilling where it's required, and mentorship then subsequently, that does really work. And I think we need to do that more, but I would go back to it. What happens then? We need the higher level, we need to go into the deeper generation process.
I would say that we've a lot already going on. We need to capture that learning. You know we have the green schools, which hasn't been mentioned, and a fantastic activation. I know my son is involved in getting those flags, and the problem solving, the learning that goes on, that needs to be captured. And I think the other thing I would say is, we need to tie this into other ambitions like the circular economy, because, the ambition that we got to kind of tackle the plastics problem in this Ireland and waste and food waste, that is all going to build to reduce our emissions. So there are ways of joining up activities that are already gone that people do care about and make them realise that they are actually all going to build towards a low-carbon society in future.
Very good. Ryan?
Yep. So in terms of coordination, that last point there about the local development sector, I think that's the key that I see from our side. Volunteers are under terrible pressure. They're being dragged left, right and centre. There's more expected of them. And now the economy is growing, there's less of them again, and there's more expected of them. Another brief has been put on climate change. There's a group called the Local Development Sector. For the last 20 years, they've been accredited and recognised by the European Union they're invested in, they're supported to deliver the National Social Inclusion Programme, bringing those people who are normally not in the conversation into a process. They exist, those structures exist all across the state. They should be, like we are, inviting them into the central role of representing and being an advocate for the volunteer, taking the hard lifting, taking the 15 hours or 20 hours and bringing the message on behalf of the community. We're doing it for social inclusion, we're doing it for rural economic development through LEADER. We should also be doing it under climate change. It's there. We have a fantastic structure. It's there.
And finally, Lorna.
Well, I think the national dialogue on climate action is really important. I think it needs to become more. I know we're going into the first phase of it, which is regional meetings. It needs to be more than a talk shop. It needs to be a real exercise in deliberative democracy, serious conversations, but it also needs to generate a moment, a national moment. I think there's a lot going on, and one way to connect everything together is to generate a sense of momentum around this. Why wouldn't we have a dialogue that culminates in something akin to the gathering? Something that generates at a national level a way to link this to the national consciousness, the psyche, that this is our moment to make a significant change, recognising, as the Taoiseach said this morning, we're coming from a very low base, but we aspire to something that's beyond what we're currently doing. So I think national dialogue, we need to make it something, and it will only become something if there's real engagement.
Great, thank you for that. So I'm going to draw this session to a close, and I'll invite Brian Carroll in just a moment. But I have to say, I found this an extremely sort of inspirational session. This is not, I have to confess, an area I know as much about as I should. But to hear about all the activity that's happening and the positivity, I think very often in Ireland we have these sort of conversations and we're dragged down in misery very, very quickly, and it's all about what we can't do. So to actually have a conversation about what we can do and what we are doing, I have to say I found it a really, really strong and positive experience. I'm sure you all did as well, but I think let's thank our panel in the usual way.
Just add my thanks to Alan and the panel. I'm just going to keep you for a few more minutes to sum up a little bit on today's event. Firstly, I think the presence of the Taoiseach here this morning and the ministers on the stage shows the level of commitment politically to addressing the challenge of climate change. Minister Nocton is still here and engaging with people. He's at the back of the room at the moment, so he's given up a morning of his time for this engagement. The Taoiseach recognised climate change as, I suppose, the existential challenge of this generation, and there was no hiding from the scale of the challenge that we face in Ireland and the need for climate action. The Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform spoke about the real increase in expenditure, and I think people need to remember that we're coming off a decade of lost investment, and we're now moving into a time where there's a very, very significant increase in expenditure coming. The Minister for Public Expenditure also spoke about the strategic clarity that we have over the next 10 years. We have funding locked in to fund the activities that we need to be engaged in. And then spoke a little bit, and it was picked up in the panel discussion, about the rider role for taxation. So the 22 billion investment in climate action over the next decade is a significant step change in climate policy. And the key to making it successful is to have engaged and empowered communities. I was going to try separately summing up both panel discussions, or what I took from them, but in fact the two almost merged into one another and a lot of the same themes came up. So what I'm going to do now is just mention some of what I took from them, with the caveat that it's probably not in any particularly coherent order, and that there is probably a lot there that isn't reflected in what I'm going to say now. But this has been recorded, so I certainly am going to be watching it in detail back at the office over the next number of days, and I think it's probably a valuable resource for people to be able to look at. It will be available on the department's website. So the first thing that struck me was just the volume of valuable volunteer activity and innovation that's already underway. The PPNs, the Wheel, People Talk, SmartChange.ie, the SEAI Sustainable Communities Programme and the success of that. So that was the first thing, that this activity is there and there are engaged people there. The second thing I took was that support was needed, and this was both professional support, expertise, but also money. And this is necessary if we're to build on the volunteerism and to scale it up. Next thing that struck me was that education doesn't necessarily imply action. And one of the first panelists spoke from moving from knowledge to installation, and I really liked that particular phrase, that it's not just about being aware, it's about acting. And then the importance of long-term planning and policy coherence. In this context, I think one of the panelists spoke about the need for aligning regulation, systems and information. And where there are conflicts or lacks of coherence in policy, because in reality there always will be in public policy trade-offs and things to be managed, the importance of being open about those trade-offs and those conflicts, and the importance of trust in the relationship between the civil service and the wider community. Then moving into the second discussion, though I say the two blended, a couple of things again from that before I finish. The issue of what do we mean by community? When we talk about community, how are we defining community? Second thing was, and this is something civil servants need to understand and policymakers need to understand, the interaction of policy with behaviour. We didn't get too much into that in the discussion, but as we're designing policy instruments, whether they're grants or whether they're tax measures or whether they're regulation, the importance of understanding how these will interact with human behaviour and influence how people make decisions and what they choose to do. Then there was a good bit of discussion around the government's framework and the need to be able to build networks of communities of best practice. And I suppose this draws on the fact there's a lot of activity there, but are we joining the dots with all that activity? The need to increase deliberation and direct engagement. And I think Father Edmund Grace gave an example of People Talk as being a very successful example of that in Galway. And then the need to sort of bring up ideas from the local level so that they can animate national policy. National Dialogue on Climate Action has been mentioned a number of times, is aiming to do that very thing. Minister Naughton's hosting the first regional event, has been said a number of times at this stage on Saturday in Athlone. But the aim is to go from the regional into the local, and within each region to have 2 to 3 local events that are very much around smaller communities and what they can do, and have that information feed back up to the regional and international policy making. There was also talk then, which was absolutely correct, about the uncertain environment we operate in and looking over long time horizons, and the fact that this is a very complex social and cultural transformation that we're about to undertake, and how that needs to be within our thinking as we approach policy making. Other actors, the role of local government. I mean, there was some talk about what role they're playing. It's worth mentioning that regional climate offices are just being established around the country. Staff are being recruited. So there is activity at local government level as well, and that will bring that regional coordination to climate action. The role of the private sector, and again clearly the private sector has a role to play, a big role to play, because this isn't all just about government expenditure, taxation, regulation. There also needs to be private sector investment, and we need to be able to induce that investment and have the right incentives there, because private investment always looks for a reward. There are some interesting ideas around financing, low interest loans, the possibility of using pension funds. I'm going to stop at that, but that was some of what I took from today. But like I say, when I watch this back over the coming days, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more there. I mean, as the government has stated, we will need to continue developing climate action policies on an ongoing basis, and we are trying to have that underpinned by real engagement that does empower citizens. And today I think was a very useful contribution to that effort. So just in closing, I'd like again to thank the Taoiseach, the ministers, Minister Naughton in particular, who was hosting this event, our moderators and panellists, Smock Alley, and those who provided the sound, lighting and whatever, catering, and most of all of you for taking the time, because I know you're all busy and I know a lot of you are probably operating as volunteers as well, but for participating today in this important event. And I look forward to meeting you in the course of my own work in the coming weeks and months, and some of you hopefully at the National Dialogue for Climate Action. So I'll close at that. Thank you very much.